You have to surrender your desire for linearity. Right? Plato would probably have been able to read the book. Aristotle, definitely not. He would have had a very hard time with this book because it does not begin in the beginning and end in the end. It just doesn't work like that. So in a sense, what the Quran really is demanding from people is that they submit to the book itself. And I think it's very fascinating that the first verse of Quran after the opening chapter is Alif Lam Mim. 3 letters, nobody knows what they mean. Every commentator on the Quran will ultimately say about these 3 letters, God knows what they mean. Now, it's a very interesting phenomenon to open up a book and the first 3 letters that you read, nobody knows what they mean. And I think part of the message there is to let us know that there's a lot of things that we don't know. And if we're not going to admit that as a starting point, we're not going to benefit from this book. If we're going to go to the book filled with ourselves, and we're going to superimpose upon the book our own ideas, then we're not going to get anything out of the book. So the book, for the 13 years, these Meccan verses are being revealed. Now if you look at the Meccan verses, they are, even though there are 85 of the chapters in Quran are Meccan. 85. 39 of them are Medina. Only 11 out of the 30 parts of the Quran, equal parts, are from Mecca. Only 11. 19 are from Medina. So the Meccan surahs or chapters are very short. And they tend to fall towards the end of the book, even though they were revealed in the beginning of this dispensation. So although the Meccan verses are the first verses, they are generally the ones that are found at the end of the book, which is very interesting. And when Muslims learn the book by heart, they will generally begin at the end. That's where they'll begin. They'll begin with the last 30th of the Quran. Now the next idea that is being introduced is the idea of what's called Sa'ah. And Sa'ah means the end of time. Now the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, his understanding of himself was that he was the first sign of the beginning of the end of the worldly existence of this Adamic species. He actually viewed himself as the first sign. In other words, all traditions that were based on revelation, according to the Islamic tradition, were basically indicating that the human experience will come to an end. And this is why within the Jewish tradition, you have an apocalyptic vision. Within the Jewish tradition, you have an apocalyptic vision. Within the Hindu tradition, you have an apocalyptic vision, the Kali Yuga period, the last period of man. Within the Buddhist tradition, you have an apocalyptic tradition. And in many of the more tribal-based traditions, within the Hopi tradition, the Kawanasqatsi, the last period in the Hopi tradition, when everything gets out of control. Within the Mayan, all these different peoples had an idea of some apocalyptic end. The apocalyptic ending in the Quran is talked about in terms of a sa'ah, which is the last moment. It's the last moment. And the Prophet Muhammad talked about signs, and the Quran mentions signs of this time. And so this was also, now ultimately, the end of time for the Muslim, in reality, is the end of our own individual life. That is our end of time. When I die, my worldly time is over. And so in a sense, the Quranic view was trying to bring people into a type of presence of the imminence of death. That death is imminent. That death is not something in some distant future. So for 13 years, this was the focus. After 13 years, the Quran is basically being memorized. And if you live with oral peoples, people that really still maintain these traditions, and I know Dr. Suleiman Yang, who's from Africa, and knows in the West African oral tradition, there are peoples that will recite epic poems of tribes. If they don't recite them exactly as they learn them, then they literally lose their job. They can't be a storyteller. So the Arabs were people that memorized poetry and related poetry exactly as it was coming. They had phenomenal memories. And I've lived with the Mauritanians in West Africa whose memories are extraordinary, like the young man who's here with us. Just phenomenal, the amount of information that he retains exactly. Now, for people that don't understand this oral tradition, they find it very hard to imagine that a human being can memorize this entire text, the Arabic text, and not make a mistake. Now, I can bring that young man here, and I can read the Quran, and I can purposely leave out a verse, and he'll correct me immediately. Now, the other thing that's interesting about the Quran is for people who memorize it, and even parts of it will quickly learn that the Quran is a self-correcting book because it has a very unusual rhythm that if you find a verse moves out of sync, suddenly you're aware, I've said something wrong. And I'll give you an example. Last week, I read the Subh prayer, and it was a rather long surah that I read. And at the end of it, I said a verse that is actually out of the Quran, but it wasn't the verse that went in that place. And it used almost these same words. And that morning, probably for the next half hour, something was bothering me, and then I realized what it was. I had said the verse wrong. And I corrected myself. Nobody corrected me in the prayer, but I corrected myself. And it's very interesting when you memorize the Quran, because I've tried to memorize a lot of things. Like, I used to memorize some poetry. I went to prep school, and you had to memorize poems and memorize like some piece of Shakespeare and things like that. The really interesting thing about it is that the Quran, one, is facilitated. It's very easy to memorize. It's not hard to memorize for many, many people. And the other thing is, it's actually quite difficult to forget it if you will recite it within reasonable time limits. Repeat it every once in a while. It's very difficult to forget. But the Hafidh, or the one who preserves the Quran, is somebody who has memorized it by rote. It usually takes about, in the Indian subcontinent, they'll do it between 1.5 to 2.5 years. In Mauritania, they have more rigorous standards because they have other things to learn than just rote memorization. They usually take about 4 years doing it. And they do it when they're children. The Arab, they say, memorization in youth is like carving in stone. And memorization in old age is like painting on water. And one of the scholars, they said, it's not that the memory's gone. It's that we've got too many worries when we get older. Children, they don't have to worry, so it all just sticks there. Whereas you get older, you're thinking about a lot of other things. But it's still phenomenal what we memorize. So during these 13 years, the Quran is being memorized this way. It's also being written by the few people who know how to write it. Because most of the Arabs were illiterate. And the Prophet Muhammad said in a sound transmission, he said, we are an illiterate people. We don't read and we don't calculate. So he was admitting that about his people. The Quran itself says, هُوَ الَّذِي بَعَثَ بِالْأُمِّيِّينَ رَسُولًا. He's the one who sent amongst the illiterates a messenger. يَتْلُو عَلَيْهِ آيَاتِهِ, that he recites to them his signs. وَيُزَكِّيهِمْ, and he purifies them. وَيُعَلِّمُهُمُ الْكِتَابَ وَالْحِكْمَةِ, and he teaches them the book and wisdom. وَإِنْ كَانُوا مِنْ قَبْلُ لَفِي ضَلَالٍ مُبِينٍ, even if they were in clear error before that. So the Prophet is seen as a messenger first and foremost to the Arabs, who are an illiterate people. Now, after 13 years of oppression, he makes a migration to Medina. Right? It's actually a flight. It's called the Hijrah. He flees there because they actually tried to kill him at that point. And he goes there, and many people begin to become Muslim. Now the Quranic discourse radically changes. From the Meccan period to the Medinan period, you will see a change between these two. The focus of the verses moves away from these topics to the social environment. How to implement. Once these have been internalized, interiorized, how are they implemented in social behavior? If you believe in God, what is that going to do to alter your character, to alter your behavior? How will that change you as an individual, as a person? So the focus becomes on character, on building a community, on building a society.